shady ladies and gentle devils, to the Fright Night version of the Dead Philosopher Society here at Clatta's Irish Tavern in Transylvania, Michigan, for a night about fear and dread and all things awful. I'm your Master of Ceremonies. My name's Darren Moore, and that was my, I just got possessed by the devil for a second there, so you have to excuse me. Welcome, man. Thanks for turning out this evening. We could not be more thrilled to have 3 published authors with us this evening to talk about Russell Kirk and how fear and dread and fright play into the defense of the permanent things. I was going to start by actually excerpting a few paragraphs from one of our authors tonight, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk really briefly about the 3 different kinds of imagination that the literary minds of conservatism focus on. The 3 kinds, first brought to us by Irving Babbitt, are the idyllic, the diabolical, and of course, the moral imagination, which comes to us from, started off with Edmund Burke, the grandfather of American conservatism. And so often, we conservatives are fighting against the centralizing statists that have the idyllic imagination, a utopian imagination, the desire to bring heaven to earth. And we're all quite familiar with the many manifestations of the idyllic imagination. However, so often we forget about the diabolical imagination. And conservatives must understand that we are fighting also against it when we fight for the true, the beautiful, and the good, the 3 graces. And so tonight, we will talk about the deceitful, the evil, and the ugly, and how the moral imagination. And think about it from this perspective. And Kirk writes so eloquently, as do so many of our favorite authors, about how the moral imagination lifts us to that level just below the angels, whereas the diabolical imagination can pull us down to that level below the animals, because animals are not capable of cruelty, are they? But we certainly know that humans are. So we are all in for a real treat this evening, and perhaps a couple tricks as well. And so with that, let me introduce our first speaker, James Person. I'm just so thrilled to see Jim here again tonight. I first met Jim on Piety Hill. Jim was the first biographer of Russell Kirk. His book, A Critical Biography of the Conservative Mind, is just a lovely biography on Russell. It's really a wonderful insight into the life and times, but also his imagination. And one of his chapters is focused on Kirk's ghastly, awful, ghostly, gothic horror stories as well. So we couldn't ask for a better person to start off the night by talking to. Let me just give you a little sense of who Jim is, however. He's also a friend of the creator of the Waltons, and wrote a well-received biography, Earl Hammer, From Walton's Mountain to Tomorrow, which appeared in 2005. He's currently working, not only was he the editor of The Unbought Grace of Life and the writer of the critical biography of Russell Kirk, but he's also now currently working on the selected letters of Russell Kirk, which I'm sure all us Kirkians are very much looking forward to. Jim is a program control engineer at Ford Motor Company. He lives here, he works in Livonia, lives in Northville with his wife Lista and daughter Rebecca. So I give to you, Jim Person.
Well, hello. It's a pleasure to be here. About 4 hours ago, I learned that I'd be speaking here tonight, so this will be interesting. I was talking a little bit earlier with several of the folks here and spoke with Harry Verizor, and Harry asked, Jim, when did you meet the Kirks? And I said, well, I first wrote to Russell Kirk back in 1986 and met him in 1992. And I visited Piety Hill in Mecosta, the home of the Kirks, many times over the years. And back in 1988, I was honored, and the people of the Methodist Church in Plymouth were very honored when we convinced Russell Kirk to come back on what they call Laity Sunday at our church to just give a talk on whatever he wanted to talk about from the pulpit of our church. And that 1988 being the centenary year of T.S. Eliot's birth, Kirk talked about T.S. Eliot. And during the course of his talk, he outlined the moral imagination, the idyllic imagination, and talked a little bit about the diabolical imagination as well. Now there were at that time 2 services at our church on Sunday morning, one at 9 o'clock, and then at the end of that there was about 45 minutes of a break time and a coffee hour and so forth, and people would go down to the church basement and mingle and talk and have coffee and donuts and chow. And to know Russell Kirk, to have known Russell Kirk, was also to know his wife, the beautiful and brilliant Annette Kirk, who is one of the most remarkable people you will ever meet in your life. Did you ever meet somebody who was, when you had been around them for a short time, you just felt more alive? That's the way she is. So during the coffee hour, Annette came up to me, and Russell had given his talk on the Christian imagination of T.S. Eliot. And Annette came up to me and she says, Jim, oh, there you are, good, listen, I need to talk to you about something. She says, you know, Russell talked about those 3 forms of the imagination, but I'm not sure that the idyllic imagination is one that people are really getting or understanding. Couldn't we just, tell Russell to talk about the moral and the diabolical? And I said, gee, Annette, I don't think I would go up and tell Russell to change his talk or anything like that. And because I was in absolute awe of the man, because he was there. And she says, yeah, I know. But don't you think it would be improved if we took out the bit about the idyllic imagination and just talked about those 2? I said, well, I guess, maybe. And so she says, oh, good, that's just what I wanted to hear. And then she says, Russell. And he was standing about 5 feet away, and he turns and says, yes. And she says, oh, good, Russell, there you are. Listen, Jim thinks it would be a great idea. No, it wasn't me. No. But he smiled and nodded, and during the second service, he gave his talk and made this seamless transition during his talk. And it all held together. It made perfect sense, and the congregation came away enlightened and just very glad that he had come, as I'm glad to have come tonight. I worked in publishing for 30 years, over 30 years, and on my first day of work, a lifetime ago, I met a young man who went on to become one of the great figures in the writing of horror fiction. Who's a man by the name of Thomas Ligotti, author of Songs of a Dead Dreamer and a bunch of other books. And over the course of our 20-year relationship in publishing, both of us as editors, Tom taught me a lot about literature. And he introduced me to the short stories of Russell Kirk. And on one occasion, we were sitting talking about literature, and he had caught me out using some terms interchangeably. He says, Jim, you don't seem to understand something about the literature we're talking about. There's a difference between terror and horror. And I said, what is that difference, Tom? He says, it is this. And I'm sorry to say this while I'm eating, but bear with me. He says, horror is a man getting his face torn off. Terror is the terrible fear that he feels while he's anticipating that happening to him. So in other words, if you've ever read, for example, Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Pit and the Pendulum, it's a story of terror, because so much of it is that anticipation and so forth. And to a great extent, that is what the short fiction of Russell Kirk is like as well. It is, you don't see graphic gore or terrible things happening, except here and there. There are a couple of stories that are that way. But for the most part, there's just this growing sense of dread With these stories, many of them are set up in the stump country around Mikasta. Some of them are set in the British Isles, in old crumbling castles and townhouses, and in places that are long forgotten, off the beaten path, where the dreadful happens. One of the first short stories I was introduced to by Tom Ligotti was titled The Invasion of the Church of the Holy Ghost, which I consider his greatest. But aside from that, another one that I have written or have read over the years is included in the collection Ancestral Shadows, highly recommended. Russell Kirk's collection of short stories called Ancestral Shadows. There's one called The Princess of All Lands, and it is based upon a true life incident in which Annette Kirk, now some of you have heard this story, Harry, you and Jay I'm sure have heard this story many times. About 45 years ago, Annette was downstate from Mikasta. She had been to a meeting in Lansing, and on her way back up 127 towards Mikasta, she was getting ready to turn onto the road, and she saw this hitchhiker standing there, a girl standing there all bundled up with this parka on. And Annette says, you know, I felt sorry for her, and I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to circle the block. And if I come back and she's still there, that means I should pick her up. So Annette circled the block, and she came back, and the girl was still there. And so she pulled over and says, you want to ride? The girl got into the car. And almost right away, Annette realized something is off here. I should not have done this. Because the girl was surly and sullen and uncommunicative. And all she really wanted to do was light up one smoke after another and basically blow smoke all over the place. She also had a paper bag in her hand, into which she had poured a great quantity of airplane glue. And every few minutes she would pick that bag up and huff into the bag and get a high off of the airplane glue. And she was starting to float away on the side. She was starting to get dizzy, sleepy, incoherent, and ornery. And after they had and so Annette was trying to make small talk to her about her and learn this bizarre history from her about how she had been married at something like the age of 16, and her husband had been shot to death the day after the wedding. And, it was quite a story. And so Annette says, well, so how far are you going? She says, well, I'm going up to Pompeii. If you've ever looked on a map of Michigan, there's a little town on one side of 127 called Pompeii, named after the ancient city in the Roman Empire. And so she says, I'm going to Pompeii. So Annette drove and tried to make small talk with this woman who was getting more and more bitter and angry and hostile as they went along. And so they got to a point in 127 where the road, there was a crossroad that took off on the direction of Pompeii. Annette pulled over. She said, well, this is as far as you go. And the girl said, I said, I'm going to Pompeii. And Annette said, I know, but I've got to go further up the road, and this is really where I have to let you out. And the girl reached into her pants and pulled out this handgun and says, you don't understand, lady. I said we're going to Pompeii. And so Annette decided, we're going to Pompeii. So she put the car back into gear, turned off, and is going down the road. And this whole time they're going along, the girl is saying, you know what? We're going to go way out in the country where nobody much ever goes. And you know what? We're going to visit my daddy. He lives in an old house back in the woods along a dirt road that nobody knows about. You know what? I'm going to give you as a present to my daddy. He likes women like you. And Annette is getting more and more filled with terror as to what might happen. And she's starting to think, I have a small child at home. I may never see her again. I have a husband at home. I may never see him again. And to her immense credit, and thanks be to God, She also kept her wits about her, and she thought, how can I outwit this girl and get out of this? So Annette started to talk to her. She drew upon her acting skills. She had studied a little bit of acting and had taught drama for a short time as a high school teacher. And she starts talking to her in this sort of, I don't know quite what you call it, a poor white accent or something. And, you know, honey, I really don't think we should be doing this now because, you know, we're going way out here and things, people might not find us. And she said, no, you just keep driving, lady. You just keep driving. They finally drove up to the driveway of this old house set out in the woods, and plainly nobody was home there. And by this time, the girl was 9. And Annette says, you know what, this is where we get out. So she swung the girl's door open, and she says, now you get on out, and I'll come back and visit you some other time, okay? I'll come back and see you. And the girl said, huh? What? Oh, okay. And Annette swung the door closed gently, put that car into reverse, and she tore out of there like Burt Reynolds in one of his old movies. And she said, the whole time I was driving, I expected a bullet to come through the back window, but nothing happened. And when she got home to Mikasta that night, she was trembling still. And she told Russell Kirk about what had happened. And Russell hugged her and comforted her and spoke to her. And at the time, he said something to the effect of, you know, if I didn't know any better, I'd say that would make a great story. So he wrote this story called The Princess of All Lands, which if you read it, there's a lot of truth and a lot of fact in it. And but in this particular case, the story comes to a supernatural conclusion. In The Princess of All, that's The Princess of All Lands. In the, I've run out of time already, haven't I?
Jim, could you take a few minutes to just tell us about the ghost aspect of Piety Hill?
Yes. Yes. When the old house at Piety Hill, where Russell Kirk lived for many years before it burned back on Ash Wednesday in 1975, was popularly known to be haunted. And you would think that a man of the immense intelligence and the great wisdom of Russell Kirk would be the first person to poo-poo that sort of thing. But he knew firsthand there were ghosts in that house, and he firmly believed in them, too. There was people who came to visit the house would ask him about things that they had seen when they spent the night there. And bizarre things that could not otherwise be explained. He said, well, that's the ghost of Raymond, cousin Raymond, who died in a mental institution after being hit over the head by a patient there. A patient battered him over the head with a hammer, and Uncle Raymond lives in this house now, and he is spotted periodically. There was another room where people heard a crying baby all the time. Russell had a Gothic imagination, meaning that he believed in the awful and to some extent, he was aware of the dark side of human existence and the terrible things that people are capable of. And he also, when he decided to build an addition onto that house, during the late 1960s, he had a large brick addition put on that was attached to the old house by a corridor. And when he built that, he wanted to make sure that the old house and the new house were attached by a subterranean corridor that would make for adventure for the children. He wanted superterranean corridors attached also. He wanted the windows on the house low enough so that little folks, the children could look out the window without getting a chair to stand on or whatever. He wanted to be this house of adventure. If he'd had his way, there would have been sliding panels, hidden passages, all the things you could imagine. But throughout the years, people did see unexplained and unnerving things at their house. Their oldest daughter, the Kirk's oldest daughter, Monica, as a young girl, and this comes out in his letters as well, frequently saw these two individuals on the property that nobody else could see. And she even had names for them, and she described them, and people knew who they were. In addition, the environs...
Is that Patty?
That's Patty.
So that's the one that Russell's aunt had played with all her childhood.
Yes.
This is still the same one that his oldest daughter was able to see.
That's correct. That's correct. So, yes. So, anyway, I'm taking time away from one of our main speakers. I just wanted to encourage you, please read the short stories of Russell Kirk. They are well worth reading. Yes, this is a copy of Ancestral Shadows. Thank you, Roger. And it is it is one of those books you never throw away. If you enjoy good fiction, this is your book. And do read The Invasion of the Church of the Holy Ghost, if you read nothing else in here. And on that note, I'd like to introduce the next person who's going to speak, and I will let Darren introduce him.
Let me do it. Two persons, everybody. Two persons.
It's interesting, those of us who know and love Mrs. Kirk, I'm sure, and even though probably some of you guys have heard that story before, that's such a scary story. I think about how much the world would have changed had, at that time, had Annette ended up like the lady in the end of the story of Flannery O'Connor wrote, Good Man is Hard to Find. Good gravy, that would be